I think it was a sense of a very special heritage or legacy. The realization that Canada was really the only Western country who seriously supported Chinese universities in the first difficult decade after the Cultural Revolution, doing really projects that encouraged lots of people-to-people interaction and exchange, while the World Bank was doing major infrastructural projects on loans. I was involved in both, and it seemed as if the Canadian piece had been forgotten and needed to be remembered. I think the most distinctive feature is the sense of timeliness, particularly when we speak to the Chinese. A young woman professor saying, I knew nothing about gender studies, and I could articulate my struggle to be accepted as a scholar through my experience in Canada. Just in the environmental area, again, a great sense of how that was so important in China's transformation. Perhaps most striking, the management program, as China suddenly had 300,000 new free enterprises with no one trained to lead them. And the Chinese officials told us how Canada was almost like a savior in providing this very extensive management training program where Canadian and Chinese universities were linked. And China was able to develop schools of business and MBAs and train professors in management. So there was a sense of timeliness and the way that fitted into some of the important issues in China's very rapid change. Well, I think for the Chinese, there was a sense that the world suddenly opened to them. And here was the opportunity to move into that world with the Canadian projects. So they're mainly very, very enthusiastic, although they somehow didn't feel well understood and there were hitches. On the Canadian side, I would say the Canadian interest was a sense of a new world to be understood and engage with. And to our surprise, we found a number of the Canadian faculty from universities said, you know, our serious international work began there because we had significant funding, we could plan for 5 or 8 years for a project, so we had to set up an international office, we had to really learn how to function internationally, particularly some of the smaller universities. And it was great that with typical Canadian geographic politics, it was widely engaged, smaller universities right across the country, not just a few major players. Conflicts did arise, although neither side wanted to emphasize that. What I found with the Canadian participants, particularly the non-sinologists, for whom it was a very, very new experience and venture, they wanted to be very careful, respectful, and to understand the Chinese political system and not push too hard on Canadian views of democracy, human rights, and so on. I found that quite moving to see how much sensitivity there was that people would bring up with me when they participated. Much freer now, but that's how it was then. On the Chinese side, I think they simply had to learn how to deal with very different ways of doing things and thinking and valuing. And some of them did indicate the Canadians were sometimes held on a bit too tight to the funding, didn't understand why we wanted a really excellent publisher for our new management textbook when the Canadians preferred a cheap provincial publisher. That was one of the conflicts that arose. So the fact that they were long-term relationships, the conflicts were gradually worked out. There was deeper understanding on both sides. I think that was a very beneficial aspect. Almost all the projects lasted at least 5 years, so that was time to work through different understandings.